The wildflower was already there when Dara Roth woke before dawn. A single stem of blue flax laid precisely across the top rail of her gate, and she decided that, after 63 days of this mystery, she would finally catch the person responsible. She had tried ignoring them at first, the flowers that appeared each morning without fail. Columbine, wild roses, yarrow, lupine, whatever happened to be blooming in the high meadows above the ridge, always fresh. Always placed with care on the same weathered post where her gate met the fence line between her land and the Olmstead property. For 2 months she had collected them in silence, pressing some, composing others, wondering if this was mockery or madness or something else entirely. Dara was not the sort of woman who received flowers. She was an orc, for one thing, with the green skin and small tusks that marked her kind. She was alone, for another, managing a struggling sheep farm on poor land that grew more rocks than grass. And she was her mother's daughter, which meant she carried a reputation for stubborn pride and a temper that flared hot when provoked. No one in the valley had ever courted her. No one had tried. So tonight she crouched in the darkness behind the hawthorn hedge that lined her yard, wrapped in a wool cloak against the autumn cold, and waited. The stars wheeled overhead. An owl called from the pine stand on the ridge. Her knees began to ache from holding still, but Dara had learned patience from her sheep, from years of watching and waiting for lambs to drop, for weather to break, for creditors to grant another month. The sky was just beginning to pale in the east when she heard it, the soft crunch of boots on the frost-stiff grass. A figure appeared from the direction of the Olmstead farmhouse, moving quietly along the fence line. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying something in one hand. As he came closer, she could make out more details in the growing light. Dark hair, work-worn clothes, a face she knew, Darren Olmstead. Dara's breath caught. Of all the people in the valley, he was perhaps the last she would have suspected. They were neighbors in the technical sense. Their properties shared a fence line that ran for nearly a quarter-mile along the ridge, but they were not friendly. They were barely civil. Darren was the district's fence viewer, appointed by the county to settle boundary disputes, and she had always assumed he looked down on her the way most humans in the valley did. They nodded to each other at church. They bid good morning when they passed on the road. But that was the extent of it. She watched as he approached her gate, moving with the careful quiet of someone who does not wish to be discovered. He held a single stem of autumn aster, purple petals still closed against the dawn. When he reached the gate, he paused, and in the gray light she saw his expression solemn, almost pained. He laid the flower across the post with the same precise care she had noticed in all the others, then stood for a moment looking at it. His lips moved as though he were speaking, but she could not hear the words. Dara stood up from behind the hedge. Darren startled so badly he nearly dropped the flower. His hand flew to his chest and he took a step back, eyes wide. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the frost-silvered grass. "Mistress Roth," he said finally, his voice rough with surprise. I thought you would be asleep," Dara finished. She stepped around the hedge and walked toward him, her boots crunching through the frozen grass. "I was, for the first 62 flowers. But this morning I decided I wanted to know who was leaving them." Even in the dim light, she could see the color rising in his face. He looked trapped, a man caught in an act he had intended to keep secret. Good. She wanted him uncomfortable. She wanted answers. "Why?" she asked, stopping a few paces from the gate. "Why have you been leaving flowers on my fence every morning for 2 months?" Darren looked down at the aster in his hand, then back at her. Something complicated moved across his face, shame, perhaps, or grief, or some mixture of both. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, as though each word cost him something. "Because I owe you," he said. "Because my father stole from your family, and I did not know how else to begin to make it right." Dara frowned. "What are you talking about?" Darren drew a breath. "The fence," he said, gesturing to the weathered rails that divided their properties. "This boundary line between your land and mine. It is wrong. My father moved it 20 years ago. He pushed it onto your land, maybe 30 feet at the widest point, and took a strip of your best pasture. Your mother never knew. No one knew except him, and now me." The words hit Dara like cold water. She stared at him, her mind racing. 20 years ago. She would have been a child, 6 or 7 years old. Her mother had still been alive then, still been trying to make the farm pay. And she remembered that year, remembered it clearly, because that was the year everything had started to go wrong. The flock had grown too large for the pasture. The ewes had gotten thin. They had lost lambs that winter. Her mother had blamed herself, blamed poor management, blamed the land. She had sold half the flock at a loss and moved them to the poorer ground on the north slope, and they had never really recovered. 30 feet, Dara said slowly. "Along the whole fence line." "Most of it," Darren confirmed. "Maybe a quarter-acre in total, the best drained pasture on the ridge." A quarter-acre. It did not sound like much, said that way. But Dara knew land. She knew what a quarter-acre of good pasture meant to a small flock. It meant the difference between thriving and struggling. It meant lambs that grew fat and healthy instead of stunted and weak. It meant selling for profit instead of selling to survive. "How do you know this?" she asked. Her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp with rising anger. "How do you know your father moved the fence?" "I found his surveying notes," Darren said. "Last spring, when I was going through his papers after he died. He had marked the original boundary in his old journals, and it did not match the current fence line. So I went out and checked it myself with a compass and chain. I found the old corner stones buried in the bracken." "The fence is wrong, Mistress Roth. It has been wrong for 20 years. Dara felt something hot and bitter rising in her chest. Her mother had died 5 years ago, worn down by work and worry, believing until the end that she had failed as a farmer. And all that time, all those years of struggle, it had been because of a lie. Because a man had moved a fence in the night and stolen what was not his. "Your father," she said, and her voice shook slightly. "Darren Olmstead, the man everyone said was so honest and upstanding." "Yes," Darren said quietly. He met her eyes and she saw that he understood her anger, accepted it. "I am sorry. I know that is inadequate. I know it does not begin to make up for what he did or for what my family has gained at your expense, but I am sorry." "And the flowers?" Dara asked. "What were those supposed to be? Payment, apology, penance," Darren said. "I did not know how to tell you. I am the fence viewer, Mistress Roth. My job is to maintain the boundaries, to settle disputes fairly and honestly, and my own inheritance is built on a crooked fence. I have been preparing to come to you to tell you the truth and offer restitution, but every day I lost my nerve. So I left flowers instead. One for each day I failed to speak. It was cowardly of me." Dara looked at him in the growing light. He stood straight, not trying to hide or deflect. His expression was grave and ashamed but honest. She realized with some surprise that she believed him. This was not the behavior of a man trying to cover up a theft. This was guilt eating at him from the inside. "What do you intend to do about it?" she asked. "Whatever you want," Darren said immediately. "The land is rightfully yours. I can restore the fence to its proper line. I can pay you damages for the 20 years of lost use. I can make a public declaration if you want the truth known. It is up to you." "And your position?" Dara pressed. "You are the fence viewer. If this becomes known, people will question every decision you have ever made. Let them, Darren said. His jaw tightened. I will not protect my reputation at the cost of what is right. The boundary should be restored. Your property should be returned to you. If that costs me my office, so be it. Dara studied him for a long moment. The sun was rising now, painting the sky pale gold behind the ridge. In the growing light she could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the shadows beneath them. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well for some time. I need to think about this, she said finally. This is not a small thing you are telling me. I know, Darren said. Take whatever time you need. I will be ready when you decide what you want to do. He set the aster down on the gate post, careful and deliberate as always, then stepped back. For a moment he hesitated, as though he wanted to say something more. Then he simply nodded to her, turned and walked back toward his own farmhouse through the brightening morning. Dara stood by her gate for a long time after he left, staring at the fence that was not where it should be. The fence that had divided her life into before and after, struggle and loss, without her ever knowing why. She picked up the aster and turned it slowly in her fingers, thinking about a man who left flowers every morning because he could not bring himself to speak the truth, and wondering what she was going to do about it. The answer, she decided by the time the sun had fully cleared the ridge, was that she was going to take back what belonged to her. Dara spent the morning with her sheep, checking them over and moving them to fresh pasture, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about what Darren had told her. A quarter acre, 20 years, her mother struggling and failing and never knowing why. By afternoon, she had made up her mind. She walked across the frost-stiff grass to the Olmstead farm and knocked on the door of the old stone farmhouse. Darren answered quickly as though he had been expecting her. He looked even more tired in the full light of day. "Mistress Roth," he said, "come in, please." "I would rather speak outside," Dara said. She did not want to be in his house to accept his hospitality when they had this business between them. Of course. Darren stepped out and closed the door behind him. He waited, his expression guarded. "I want the land back," Dara said without preamble. "Not moved privately in the night the way your father took it. I want it done properly, through the law. I want a hearing before the county and a judgment in the records, so that everyone knows the boundary was wrong and why." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, looking for resistance or doubt. She saw neither. He simply nodded slowly. "That is fair," he said. "More than fair. I will petition for a hearing myself. I can bring my father's notes as evidence, and we can survey the line together to show where it should be." "You understand what that means?" Dara pressed. "You will have to testify against your own inheritance. You will have to admit publicly that your father was a thief." "He was a thief," Darren said quietly. "And I have been benefiting from that theft for 20 years without knowing it. Yes, Mistress Roth, I understand what it means, and I am prepared to do it." "Good," Dara said. She felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "Then we should begin gathering the evidence. You said you found cornerstones." "Yes, and I have my father's old journals, but we will need more than that. We will need testimony from neighbors who remember the old boundary if any are still alive. We will need the original land grants from the county records. We will need a complete survey of both properties." "That will take time," Dara said. "Yes," Darren agreed. "Probably weeks if we do it properly. Maybe longer." Dara considered this. Weeks of working together, gathering evidence, building a case. It felt strange, the idea of collaborating with a man she had barely spoken to before this morning. But if she wanted this done right, done legally and publicly, she would need his help. He had the knowledge and the access that she lacked. "When can we start?" she asked. "Now, if you want," Darren said. I can show you the corner stones this afternoon. Tomorrow we can ride into town and check the county records. Dara nodded. All right, show me the stones. They walked together along the fence line, Darren leading the way. The autumn air was crisp and clean, smelling of frost and pine. The land rose gently toward the ridge, old pasture dotted with outcrops of gray stone. Dara knew every foot of her own property, but she had never paid close attention to where exactly the fence ran. Why would she? Fences were fixed things, boundary lines set by surveyors and law, except when they were not. Darren stopped at a point about 200 feet from her gate, where the fence jogged slightly to the north. He stepped over the rails and pushed through a thick growth of bracken and wild raspberry canes. Dara followed, the dried vegetation crackling under her boots. Here, Darren said, crouching down and pushing aside a tangle of dead ferns. This is the first one. Dara knelt beside him and saw it, a squared stone about the size of a man's head, moss-covered and half buried in the earth. The top surface had been carved with a cross and the initials RH. Robert Harrow, Darren said, seeing her look at the letters. He was the surveyor who laid out the original grants 45 years ago. This is his mark. The boundary should run from here. He stood and moved further along the line, deeper into the bracken. Dara followed, and he showed her 2 more stones, both carved with the same mark, both buried in vegetation well inside what was currently Olmstead land. When she stood and looked back toward the fence, she could see how far off it was. 30 feet at least, maybe more in some places. How did he do it? She asked. How did your father move a fence without anyone noticing? The stones were already overgrown, Darren said. No one had looked at them in decades, and he did not move the whole fence at once. He did it in sections over a few years, taking down a few rails here, adding a few there. By the time he was finished, the new line looked old. People see what they expect to see. Except he knew, Dara said, her voice hard. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, Darren said. He met her eyes. He knew, and I am sorry for it more than I can say. Dara looked away from him, back toward the buried stones. She felt the anger simmering in her chest, but it was complicated now by other feelings. Sadness for her mother, frustration at the years lost. And strangely, something almost like sympathy for the man standing beside her, who had learned that his father was not who he thought he was. Stop apologizing, she said abruptly. You did not do this. Your father did. I need you focused on fixing it, not wallowing in guilt. Darren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are right. I will focus on the work. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the fence line together, documenting the locations of the old boundary stones and measuring the distances to the current fence. Darren had brought his surveying equipment, and he taught Dara how to use the compass and chain, showing her how to sight along the old boundary and calculate the area that had been taken. As they worked, they talked. Not about the fence at first, but about the land itself. Darren pointed out features Dara had never noticed. The way the ground sloped slightly to catch the morning sun, the presence of spring-fed pockets that stayed green even in dry summers. The stolen strip, she realized, was not just good pasture. It was the best pasture on the whole ridge. Your father chose carefully, she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. He did, Darren agreed. He was a good farmer, just not a good man. They worked until the light began to fail, then walked back toward their respective houses. At the fence line between them, Darren paused. Thank you, he said. Dara frowned. For what? For giving me the chance to make this right, Darren said. You could have simply reported me to the county. You could have demanded I resign my office immediately. Instead, you are letting me help fix what my father broke. I am not doing you a favor, Dara said sharply. I need your knowledge and your records to win this case. Do not mistake practicality for forgiveness." "I won not," Darren said, but there was something in his expression, relief, maybe, or gratitude, that made Dara uncomfortable. She nodded brusquely and turned toward her own house. "Tomorrow," she called back, "early, we ride for the county seat." "I will be ready," Darren said. Dara did not look back. They rode into town the next morning on Darren's horses, a matched pair of sturdy bays. Dara had only one horse, an aging mare, and Darren had offered the use of his without hesitation. It was a 2-hour ride down from the ridge to the county seat, a market town called Milford that sat at the confluence of two rivers. They rode in silence for the first hour. Dara was not comfortable on horseback. She was a shepherd, not a rider, and she focused on staying balanced and not embarrassing herself. But as they descended into the valley and the road leveled out, she found herself relaxing slightly. "You ride well," Darren said, breaking the silence. "I do not," Dara said flatly. "I am staying on by stubbornness and luck." Darren smiled just slightly. "Perhaps, but stubbornness counts for a lot." Dara glanced at him. He sat his horse with easy confidence, reins loose in one hand. He looked different outside the context of the farm, younger, somehow, though she knew he was near her own age of 26. The morning light caught in his dark hair and softened the lines of tension around his eyes. "How long have you been fence viewer?" she asked, partly to distract herself from noticing these things. 3 years, Darren said. "I was appointed after my father died. He held the position for 20 years before me. And no one questioned whether you could be impartial." "Some did," Darren admitted. "But I had a reputation for fairness. I settled a dispute between the Merrick and Chen families the year before my father died, and both sides accepted my judgment. That helped." "What was the dispute?" "Water rights," Darren said. The Merricks had built a mill dam that backed up the creek onto Chen land. Both families had been arguing about it for 10 years. I surveyed the creek, checked the original grants, and determined that the dam was legal, but that the Merricks owed compensation for the flooding. They paid, the Chens accepted, and the feud ended. Dara considered this. "So you do know how to be impartial even when it costs someone." "I try," Darren said. "The law is meant to be fair, even when fairness is painful." They reached Milford just before noon and stabled the horses at an inn near the town center. The county courthouse was a 3-story brick building that dominated the main square. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust and old wood. A clerk directed them to the records office on the 2nd floor. The records clerk was a thin, elderly man named Oswin, who peered at them over a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. "Help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he would rather not. "We need to see the land grants for the Roth and Olmstead properties on the North Ridge," Darren said. "The original surveys from 45 years ago, and any amendments or transfers since then." Oswin sighed deeply, as though this was an enormous imposition, but he turned and began pulling ledgers from the shelves that lined the walls. He dropped 3 massive volumes onto the table with a thud. "Roth and Olmstead, North Ridge, have at it. You damage those pages, you pay for rebinding." "We will be careful," Darren said. They spent the next several hours poring over the records. The documents were written in a cramped, formal hand that made Dara's eyes ache. But slowly, with Darren's help, she began to piece together the history of the land. Her family's grant had been issued to her grandfather, Matthias Roth, in the year 1781. 160 acres of ridge land, bounded on the south by the Olmstead grant, on the north by unclaimed forest, on the east by the old Drovers Road. The survey had been conducted by Robert Harrow, and the corners marked with carved stones. The Olmstead grant, issued the same year to Darren's grandfather, was 140 acres of similar land, bounded on the north by the Roth grant. The boundary between them was described in careful detail. From the great oak at the Drover's Road, west-northwest to the granite outcrop, thence west to the spring below the ridge, thence southwest to the creek. Dara traced the words with one finger. "The spring below the ridge," she said. "I know where that is. It is 30 feet inside your current fence line." Darren nodded grimly. "I know. I checked it when I found my father's notes." They made copies of the relevant passages, Dara writing slowly and carefully to ensure accuracy. Then Darren asked Oswin if there were any other records related to the two properties' amendments, surveys, dispute resolutions. Oswin checked his ledgers and shook his head. "Nothing. No changes to the original grants, no recorded disputes. Far as the county knows, that boundary has been fixed since 1781. Until now," Dara said quietly. They left the courthouse as the afternoon sun slanted across the square. Dara felt exhausted but also grimly satisfied. They had evidence. They had documentation. They had the beginnings of a case. "Are you hungry?" Darren asked as they walked back toward the inn. Dara realized she was. They had left early and eaten nothing but bread and cheese in the saddle. "Yes. There is a tavern near the stables that serves decent food," Darren said. "We should eat before we ride back." Dara hesitated. Sharing a meal felt different from working together on the survey, more personal somehow, but she was hungry and it was practical. All right. The tavern was warm and crowded with the afternoon trade. They found a table near the back and ordered stew and bread. For a while they ate in silence, too hungry to talk. But eventually Dara found herself asking, "What was he like?" "Your father," Darren looked up from his bowl, surprised. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I am trying to understand why he did it," Dara said. "Was he desperate? Was the farm failing? Or did he do it simply because he could?" Darren set down his spoon. "The farm was not failing. We were comfortable, not wealthy, but comfortable. He did not need the extra land." "Then why?" "I think," Darren said slowly, "that he did it because he wanted to be successful. To be seen as a successful farmer. And success in his mind meant more land, bigger yields, more stock. He saw an opportunity to take a little more and he took it. He justified it to himself, I am sure. Told himself it was not really stealing, just correcting an error, or that your family would not miss it. But at the core of it, he did it because he wanted what was not his." Dara felt a cold anger settling in her chest. "My mother never thought of herself as a successful farmer. She died thinking she had failed." "I know," Darren said. His voice was rough with emotion. "And I cannot change that. I cannot bring her back or give her the years she spent struggling. All I can do is restore what was taken and make sure the record shows the truth." Dara looked at him across the table. His expression was open and pained, and she realized that he had loved his father and was now grappling with the knowledge that the man he loved had been capable of casual cruelty. It was not the same as her loss, but it was still a loss. "We should head back," she said, her voice softer than before. "It will be dark before we reach the ridge." They rode home as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The horses knew the road and needed little guidance, which was fortunate, because Dara's attention kept drifting. She found herself watching Darren as they rode, noting the way he sat his horse, the way the fading light caught on his profile. She pushed the thoughts away, irritated with herself. This was business, not courtship. He was helping her because he owed her, because it was the right thing to do, nothing more. But when they reached the fence line between their properties and he helped her dismount, his hand steadying her as her feet found the ground, she felt something shift in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the work they were doing. Dangerous, she thought. Foolish. But the feeling persisted as she walked back to her own house through the gathering dark. Over the following days they fell into a routine. Mornings, Dara worked her farm, tending her sheep and maintaining her fences and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a homestead running. Afternoons, she and Darren met at the boundary line and worked on the case. They surveyed the land again, more carefully this time, making detailed maps. They searched for anyone who might remember the old boundary, but most of the neighbors from 45 years ago were dead or had moved away. They did find one elderly woman, a widow named Esther Crane, who remembered Dara's grandfather and the original survey. Matthias Roth, Esther said, her voice thin and wavering with age. I remember him. Good man. Honest. He was so proud of that land, especially the pasture below the ridge. Said it would support his flock for generations. Do you remember where the boundary was? Darren asked gently. Between the Roth and Olmstead properties. Esther frowned, her eyes distant with memory. There was a spring, she said, just below the ridgeline. That was the marker, I think. The boundary ran through there. The spring is currently on Olmstead land, Dara said carefully. Esther's frown deepened. That does not sound right. I am sure the spring was on Roth land. Matthias used to water his flock there. They took her statement in writing, and Esther signed it with a shaky hand. It was not much, but it was corroboration. It was evidence that the boundary had been different once. As they worked, Dara found herself looking forward to the afternoons. She told herself it was just because the case was progressing, because they were building something solid and undeniable. But she knew, in the quiet corners of her mind, that it was also because she enjoyed Darren's company. He was knowledgeable without being condescending. He listened when she spoke. He had a quiet sense of humor that surprised her, slipping out in small observations that made her smile despite herself. And he worked hard, never complaining, never trying to shortcut the difficult parts. One afternoon, as they were packing up their surveying equipment, Darren said, "Can I ask you something?" Dara looked up. "What? Why did you stay?" he asked. "On the farm, I mean, after your mother died. You could have sold it, moved to town, found easier work." Dara considered the question. No one had asked her that before. Most people assumed she stayed because she had no choice, because an orc woman had few options. "Because it is mine," she said finally. "My grandfather cleared that land. My mother worked it her whole life. They are buried on the North Hill, under the oak trees. I was not going to let that go just because it was hard." Darren nodded slowly. "I understand that, the weight of inheritance." "Do you?" Dara asked. "You just found out your inheritance is built on theft." "Yes," Darren said, "and that makes it heavier, not lighter. I cannot undo what my father did, but I can make sure I do not compound it." They looked at each other in the slanting afternoon light. Dara felt that warmth in her chest again, stronger now. She turned away, focusing on coiling the surveying chain. "We should finish the maps tomorrow. Then we can petition for a hearing." "Agreed," Darren said quietly. That night, Dara lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams. She kept thinking about Darren's hands as he had shown her how to use the compass. The way he listened when she spoke, as though her words mattered. The look in his eyes when he talked about making things right. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "This is a business arrangement. He is helping you reclaim stolen land. That is all." But when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of wildflowers laid on a fence post, one for each day of yearning. They finished the maps and submitted a formal petition to the county for a boundary hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, on the first Monday in December. The delay was frustrating but unavoidable. The county judge had a full docket, and boundary disputes were not considered urgent. Word of the petition spread quickly through the valley. Dara began to notice a change in how her neighbors treated her. Some were supportive, like old Esther Crane, who stopped by one morning with a basket of apples and words of encouragement. But others were cool, even hostile. The problem, Dara realized, was that Darren was well liked. He was the fence viewer, a position of trust and authority. People respected him. And now, he was publicly accusing his own father of moving a boundary, which meant calling into question all the other boundaries his father had certified over the years. Neighboring landowners who had relied on Darren Olmstead's surveys were suddenly uncertain about their own property lines. At church the following Sunday, Dara felt the eyes on her. People whispered behind their hands. A few greeted her with cold nods, and when she approached the well after the service to draw water, a small group of men blocked her way. The leader was a thick-bodied farmer named Garrett Spence, who owned land on the south side of the ridge. "Mistress Roth," he said, his voice carrying a note of false politeness. "Heard you have been making trouble for Darren Olmstead." "I am not making trouble," Dara said evenly. "I am reclaiming land that was stolen from my family." "That is a serious accusation," another man said, "calling Darren Olmstead a thief." "It is not an accusation," Dara said. "It is a fact. The boundary was moved illegally and I have evidence to prove it." "Evidence provided by Darren," Garrett said. "Seems convenient, does it not? The fence viewer suddenly turning on his own father, helping an orc woman make claims against his own land. Makes a man wonder what else might be going on." The implication in his tone was clear and vile. Dara felt heat rising in her face, a mix of anger and humiliation. "Watch your mouth, Garrett." "Or what?" Garrett stepped closer, looming over her. "You will call the fence viewer." "Oh, wait. He is the one you are, that is enough." The voice came from behind Dara. She turned and saw Darren striding toward them, his expression thunderous. He stepped between her and Garrett, forcing the larger man to step back. "If you have a problem with the boundary petition, Garrett, you can raise it at the hearing," Darren said, his voice hard. "Until then, keep your insinuations to yourself." "Just looking out for the community," Garrett said, but he stepped back further, making sure everyone's interests are protected. "Mistress Roth's interests are protected by the law," Darren said. "As are yours. The hearing will be fair and public. If you do not trust me to be impartial, you are welcome to petition for a different adjudicator." "Maybe I will," Garrett said. But he turned and walked away, his friends following. Dara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you." "You should not have to deal with that," Darren said. He looked angry but also troubled. "I am sorry. This is my fault." "It is not your fault that some people are narrow-minded fools," Dara said. "It is my fault that my petition has made you a target," Darren said. "I knew there would be pushback, but I did not think it would get personal so quickly." "I can handle Garrett Spence," Dara said, but even as she said it, she felt uneasy. Garrett had friends, he had influence, and he had just made it clear that he saw her petition as a threat. Over the next few weeks, the situation worsened. Someone cut down a section of Dara's fence, letting her sheep wander onto the road. She found the fence repaired the next morning. Darren had done it in the night, but the message was clear. Someone drove their wagon through her vegetable garden, crushing the last of the autumn greens. Someone started a rumor that she was trying to cheat the Olmstead family out of their rightful property. And someone, she noticed, had stopped leaving flowers on her fence post. She found herself missing them, those small, silent tokens. They had been Darren's guilt made visible, his apology rendered in petals and stems. But they had also been beautiful, a bright spot in her mornings. Now they were gone, replaced by the grim work of legal preparation. She saw Darren less, too. He was busy preparing his own testimony, gathering his father's records, dealing with challenges to his authority as fence viewer. When they did meet, he was distracted and tense. "The county has received 3 complaints about me," he told her one gray afternoon as they reviewed their evidence, "all claiming I am too biased to adjudicate the boundary dispute." "Will they remove you?" Dara asked, alarmed. "Not from the case," Darren said. "I am a witness, not the judge." "But they might remove me from my position as fence viewer. There will be a vote after the hearing." "Because you told the truth," Dara said bitterly. "Because I am calling my father a liar," Darren corrected, "and in doing so, calling into question every boundary he ever certified." "People are scared, Dara. They are scared that if my father moved one fence, he might have moved others." "Did he?" "I do not know," Darren said. "I have gone through all his records. Yours is the only one where I found evidence of fraud, but I cannot prove a negative." "I cannot prove he did not move other fences, too." Dara looked at him. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his face drawn. "Maybe you should step away," she said quietly. "Let me pursue this on my own. You have given me the evidence. I can hire a surveyor to testify." "No," Darren said immediately. "This is my responsibility. I will see it through. Even if it costs you everything." "Even then," Darren said. He met her eyes, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "You deserve justice, Dara. Your mother deserved better." "I will not walk away from that." The way he said her name, soft and deliberate, made something twist in her chest. She looked away, suddenly flustered. "We should go over the survey notes again," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Make sure we have everything right." They worked until dark, but Dara's mind kept wandering. She found herself watching Darren as he bent over the maps, noting the way his hands moved, precise and careful. The way he frowned slightly when he was concentrating. The way a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. "Stop it," she told herself again, but it was getting harder to listen. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the first real frost of winter silvering the fields. Dara dressed in her best clothes, a simple wool dress in deep blue that her mother had made years ago. She braided her dark hair carefully and checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door. She looked nervous, she thought, and she was. Darren met her at the fence line, dressed in formal clothes she had never seen him wear before. Dark coat, clean shirt, his hair neatly combed. He looked like a different person, except for his eyes, which were the same steady brown she had come to know. "Ready?" he asked. "As I will ever be," Dara said. They rode to Milford together, not speaking much. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. News of the hearing had spread, and it seemed like half the valley had come to watch. Dara saw Garrett Spence in the crowd, along with several other landowners whose properties bordered those Darren Olmstead had surveyed. She saw Esther Crane, who gave her an encouraging nod. She saw the pastor from her church, and the merchant who bought her wool, and dozens of others. The hearing room was a large, wood-paneled chamber on the second floor. At the front was a raised bench where the county judge would sit. To one side was a table for petitioners, to the other a table for respondents. Dara took her seat at the petitioners' table, her heart hammering. Darren sat at the respondents' table, even though he was also her primary witness. It was a strange arrangement, but legally he was the owner of the disputed land, so he had to sit as respondent. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her 50s named Margaret Thorne. She called the hearing to order and asked Dara to state her petition. Dara stood, her legs shaking slightly. She had practiced this, but speaking in front of so many people was harder than she had imagined. "Your Honor, I am petitioning to restore the boundary between my property and the Olmstead property to its original, legally surveyed line." The current fence line is incorrect and was moved illegally approximately 20 years ago. Judge Thorne looked at her over her spectacles. That is a serious claim, Mistress Roth. What evidence do you have? Dara presented the evidence methodically. The original land grants, showing the boundary running through the spring below the ridge. The current survey, showing the fence line 30 feet south of the spring. The carved boundary stones, still in place and marked with the surveyor's initials. Esther Crane's testimony about the location of the original boundary. And finally, Darren Olmstead's own surveying notes provided by Darren, which showed that he had measured the original boundary and then moved the fence. The courtroom was silent as she laid it all out. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but she kept her voice steady and her hands from shaking. When she finished, Judge Thorne turned to Darren. Mr. Olmstead, you are the respondent in this case, but I understand you are also providing testimony in support of the petitioner. Yes, Your Honor, Darren said. He stood, and Dara saw that he looked calm, resolved. I found my father's surveying notes last spring. When I compared them to the current fence line, I realized the boundary had been moved. I conducted my own survey and confirmed that the current fence is not in the correct location. The evidence Mistress Roth has presented is accurate. The land in question rightfully belongs to her. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Thorne raised a hand for silence. You are testifying that your own father moved the boundary illegally. Yes, Your Honor, Darren said. I am. And you stand to lose a quarter-acre of land and likely your position as fence viewer by making this testimony. Yes, Your Honor, Darren said, but none of that changes the truth. The boundary was moved. The land should be restored to Mistress Roth. Judge Thorne studied him for a long moment. Then she said, This court appreciates your honesty, Mr. Olmstead. However, given that you are both respondent and primary witness for the petitioner, I am going to ask if there are any other witnesses who can corroborate this evidence. That was when Garrett Spence stood up. I have something to say, Your Honor. Judge Thorne looked at him. You are. Garrett Spence. My land borders the old Olmstead property on the south side, and I have reason to believe that Darren Olmstead moved that boundary too. Dara's heart sank. This was what she had feared, that the case would open up questions about other properties, muddying the waters. But Garrett was not finished. In fact, he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, I think Darren Olmstead is trying to distract from that fact by throwing his father under the wagon with this Roth business. He is sacrificing a quarter-acre he does not care about to protect the larger parcels that matter. That is a lie, Darren said, his voice sharp. Is it? Garrett challenged. You have been spending a lot of time with Mistress Roth, meeting in private, riding to town together. Seems mighty convenient that you are suddenly so eager to help her. Makes a man wonder what your real motivations are. Judge Thorne banged her gavel. Mr. Spence, unless you have evidence relevant to this case, sit down. I have evidence, Garrett said. I have a survey from 15 years ago that shows my southern boundary is not where Darren Olmstead said it was. And I am willing to bet there are others in this room with similar problems. This is not about one fence, Your Honor. This is about a pattern of fraud, and Darren Olmstead is trying to cover it up by looking like a hero. The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, arguing, pointing. Judge Thorne banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Dara sat frozen, watching as everything spun out of control. Finally, Judge Thorne got the room quiet. Mr. Spence, she said coldly, if you have a boundary dispute, you may file your own petition. This hearing is about the Roth-Olmstead boundary and only that. Do you have any testimony relevant to that specific case? Garrett hesitated. No, Your Honor, but I think the court should consider. Sit down, Mr. Spence. Garrett sat, but the damage was done. The room was buzzing with speculation and accusation. Dara could see Judge Thorne calculating, weighing the evidence against the chaos. Finally, the judge spoke. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the petitioner has demonstrated that the boundary between the Roth and Olmstead properties was moved from its original surveyed location. However, given the serious questions raised about other potential boundary issues involving surveys conducted by Darren Olmstead, I am ordering a full review of all property boundaries in the North Ridge area. Until that review is complete, I am postponing my final judgment on the Roth petition. Dara felt like she had been punched. Your Honor, my decision is final, Mistress Roth, Judge Thorne said. The review will take approximately 3 months. At that time, I will issue a final ruling on your petition, along with any other boundary corrections that are warranted. This hearing is adjourned. She banged the gavel and it was over. Dara sat in stunned silence as the courtroom emptied around her. 3 more months. 3 more months of waiting, of uncertainty, of being under scrutiny. And for what? She had done everything right. She had the evidence. She had the truth. But the truth apparently was not enough. Darren approached her table, his face ashen. Dara, I am so sorry. I did not expect. Do not, Dara said, her voice tight. Just do not. She stood and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The winter that followed was the coldest Dara could remember. Not because of the weather, though it was bitter, but because of the silence. The silence from Darren, who did not come to her fence line anymore. The silence from her neighbors, who avoided her at church and in town. The silence from the county, which was conducting its review with no updates or communication. She threw herself into the work of the farm. She moved her sheep to winter pasture, repaired fences, cut and stacked firewood. She kept her head down and her hands busy, because if she stopped moving, she started thinking. And thinking led to anger, and anger led to despair. She had been so close. The evidence had been clear, the case solid. And then Garrett Spence had opened his mouth and turned it into a circus, a question about all of Darren Olmstead's work instead of just the one boundary that mattered to her, and Darren. She did not know what to think about Darren. He had testified for her, had risked his reputation and position. But Garrett's insinuations had stung because there was a kernel of truth in them. She and Darren had grown close during the weeks of preparing the case. She had started to care for him, started to think of him as more than just an ally in a legal dispute, and maybe that had been foolish. Maybe Garrett was right, and Darren's motivations were not as pure as they seemed. Maybe he was protecting himself or his family's reputation, or something else entirely. She did not know. And not knowing was worse than anger. 3 weeks after the hearing, there was a knock on her door. Dara opened it to find Esther Crane on her doorstep, bundled against the cold. Mistress Crane, Dara said, surprised. Come in, please. It is freezing out there. Esther shuffled inside, accepting a cup of hot tea with gnarled hands. I wanted to check on you, she said. You have not been to church the last 2 weeks. I have been busy, Dara said, which was only partly true. You have been hiding, Esther said bluntly. Cannot say I blame you after what happened at that hearing. Garrett Spence is a pig-headed fool. Despite everything, Dara smiled slightly. I will not argue with that. But you should not let him drive you into isolation, Esther continued. You did the right thing filing that petition. Your mother would be proud. Dara's throat tightened. My mother should never have had to struggle the way she did. If I had known sooner, if I had noticed the boundary was wrong. How could you have noticed? Esther interrupted. You were a child when it was moved, and by the time you were old enough to pay attention, the fence had been there for years. You cannot blame yourself for not knowing. I suppose, Dara said, though she did not quite believe it. Esther sipped her tea, eyeing Dara over the rim of the cup. Have you spoken to Darren Olmstead since the hearing? No, Dara said shortly. Why not? Because I do not know what to say to him, Dara admitted. I do not know if I can trust him. Why would you not trust him? Esther asked. He testified for you. He brought you the evidence in the first place. Garrett said a lot of things, most of them nonsense, Esther interrupted. That boy has been carrying a grudge against the Olmsteads since Torben ruled against him in a water dispute 10 years ago. He would say anything to cause trouble. But what if he is right? Dara asked. What if Darren is only helping me to protect himself? Esther set down her cup and fixed Dara with a stern look. Listen to me, girl. I have known Darren Olmstead since he was a boy. He is his father's son, in some ways stubborn, hardworking, proud. But he is not a liar and he is not a schemer. If he says he is helping you because it is the right thing to do, then that is the truth. How can you be sure? Because I saw his face when he testified, Esther said. That was not a man protecting himself. That was a man trying to make amends for something he had no part in. And that is a rare thing, Dara. Most people would have kept quiet, would have let the crooked fence stay crooked and counted themselves lucky. Darren did not do that. He chose to tell the truth, even knowing it would cost him. Dara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, He stopped leaving flowers on my fence. Esther raised an eyebrow. Flowers. Dara felt her face heat. She had not meant to say that. But now that it was out, she explained the wildflowers that had appeared every morning for 2 months before the confrontation, the way they had stopped when the case became public. Well, Esther said when she finished, that is interesting. It was guilt, Dara said. That is all. Guilt does not last 2 months, Esther said dryly. And guilt does not choose flowers as beautiful as the ones you are describing. That boy was courting you, Dara. He just did not know how to say it. That is ridiculous, Dara said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Esther stood, gathering her cloak. You should talk to him. Hear what he has to say, because I think you care about him too, and you are letting fear and pride keep you apart. After Esther left, Dara sat by her fire for a long time thinking. The old woman's words circled in her mind, insistent and uncomfortable. Could Esther be right? Had the flowers been more than guilt? She thought about the way Darren had looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was not paying attention. The care he had taken in teaching her to use the surveying equipment. The way he had stepped between her and Garrett at the church, protective and fierce. And she thought about the way she felt when she was with him. Safe. Understood. Seen. She had been lying to herself, she realized. She had told herself she was angry at him for the hearing going wrong, but that was not the real reason for the distance between them. The real reason was fear. Fear that Garrett was right, that there was something between them that complicated everything. Fear that if she let herself care, she would be hurt. Fear that an orc woman and a human man could never really bridge the gap between them. But fear, she thought, was no way to live. The next morning, she walked across the frost-hard fields to the Olmstead farmhouse. She knocked on the door, her heart hammering. Darren opened it and his eyes widened with surprise. Dara, can I come in? She asked. Of course. He stepped aside and she entered. The house was neat but cold, as though he had not been keeping the fire high. He looked thin, she thought. Worn. I owe you an apology, Dara said without preamble. I walked out of that hearing without letting you speak. I have been avoiding you ever since. That was unfair. You do not owe me anything, Darren said. The hearing was a disaster. I should have anticipated that Garrett would cause trouble. You could not have known, Dara said. And even if you had, it would not have changed the truth of the evidence. The judge postponed the ruling, but she did not deny my claim. That means something. It means 3 more months of waiting, Darren said. 3 more months of uncertainty and scrutiny for you. For both of us, Dara corrected. You are under as much scrutiny as I am, more probably. Darren gave a short, humorless laugh. Yes, the county has launched a formal review of my work as fence viewer. They are checking every boundary I have certified in the last 3 years, and there will be a vote after the hearing is resolved on whether I should keep my position. I am sorry, Dara said quietly. Do not be, Darren said. This is not your fault. None of it is your fault. My father stole from you, and I am the one who has to live with the consequences of that theft. If I lose my position, so be it. Dara stepped closer to him. Why did you stop leaving flowers on my fence? Darren looked startled. I thought it would be inappropriate. Once the case became public, once we were working together, it seemed wrong to keep doing something so personal. Personal, Dara repeated. Esther Crane said you were courting me. Darren's face flushed. Esther Crane is a meddling old woman. She is also usually right, Dara said. Were you courting me? Darren was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I do not know. At first it was guilt, just as I said. I owed you, and I did not know how to pay that debt, so I left flowers. But after a while it became something else. I started choosing flowers I thought you would like. I started looking forward to the walk across the field in the morning, to imagining you finding them. And then I started thinking about you at other times, wondering what you were doing, whether you were warm enough, whether your flock was healthy, whether you ever thought about me. Dara's breath caught. I did, she admitted. I do. That is what scares me. Why does it scare you? Because you are the fence viewer and I am an orc woman, Dara said. Because your father stole from my family and we are in the middle of a legal case. Because people like Garrett already have vile things to say about us. Because there are 100 reasons this is complicated and difficult and probably doomed. And yet, Darren prompted softly. And yet when I think about not seeing you, about going back to the way things were before, it feels wrong, Dara said. I miss talking to you. I miss working with you. I miss the flowers. Darren reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm against hers. I miss you too, every day. But I did not want to burden you with that, not when you are dealing with so much else. It is not a burden, Dara said. She laced her fingers through his, marveling at how natural it felt. It is the opposite of a burden. They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, looking at each other in the dim light of the cold farmhouse. Then Darren said, The review will take 3 months. After that, the judge will rule, and I will probably lose my position. I will just be a farmer with a smaller farm, a man whose father was a thief. Is that someone you want to be involved with? I am a shepherd whose mother died poor because your father was a thief, Dara said. I would say we are evenly matched. Darren smiled, a real smile, the first she had seen from him in weeks. Then maybe we can face the next 3 months together instead of apart. I would like that, Dara said. He squeezed her hand gently. Can I start bringing you flowers again? Yes, Dara said. But maybe bring them to my door this time instead of leaving them on the fence. I would rather see you when you give them to me. I can do that, Darren said softly. The 3 months that followed were hard, but they were also good. The county's review ground on, examining every property boundary in the North Ridge area. Surveyors came and went. Old records were pulled and checked. Neighbors testified about where they thought their boundaries were. It was exhausting and invasive, and everyone involved was on edge. But through it all, Dara and Darren had each other. He came to her house every morning, carrying whatever flowers he could find in the winter landscape, late asters, dried seed heads, evergreen branches with red berries. They had breakfast together, then worked on their respective farms, then met again in the evenings to share dinner and talk. They talked about everything. Their childhoods, their parents, their dreams for the future. Dara told him about her mother, about the way she had taught Dara to read the weather and know when the ewes were ready to lamb. Darren told her about his father, about the complicated love he felt for a man who had been kind to his family but cruel to others. They talked about what they would do after the hearing. If Dara won and they both believed the boundary would be restored. She would gain back the quarter-acre of good pasture. She could expand her flock, improve her yields, maybe even start to prosper instead of just survive. If Darren lost his position as fence viewer, and they both knew he would still have his farm, diminished but viable. He could focus on the land, on breeding better stock, on building something honest. "I think I would be relieved," Darren admitted one evening as they sat by Dara's fire. "Being fence viewer has been a weight, always worrying about being fair, about whether I am making the right decisions. If I am just a farmer, I can focus on my own land and let someone else worry about everyone else's boundaries." "You are a good fence viewer," Dara said. "Even the people who are angry at you know that." "Maybe," Darren said, "but I think my time in that role is over, and I am all right with that." As winter deepened, they also had to deal with the continued hostility from some of their neighbors. Garrett Spence's petition for his own boundary review had been folded into the county's larger investigation, and he was not happy about it. He made a point of glaring at Dara whenever he saw her, and he spread rumors that she and Darren were using the legal case as a cover for an improper relationship. The rumors stung, but they also brought Dara and Darren closer together. They stopped hiding their affection. Darren held her hand when they walked to church together. Dara kissed his cheek when he left her house in the evenings. If people were going to talk anyway, they decided they might as well have something real to talk about. Not everyone was hostile. Esther Crane was delighted by the development and made sure everyone knew she had predicted it. The pastor, a kind man named Father Benedict, made a point of speaking to them both warmly after services. And some of the younger families in the valley, the ones who had not been around during Darren Olmstead's time, were supportive. They saw Darren's honesty as admirable, not threatening, but there were still hard days. Days when Dara wondered if the fight was worth it. Days when Darren looked exhausted from the constant scrutiny. They supported each other through it, taking turns being strong when the other was weak. And slowly, winter began to turn toward spring. The final hearing was scheduled for the 1st of March. By that time, the county's review was complete. The surveyors had checked every boundary in the North Ridge area, and the results were mixed. Most of Darren Olmstead's surveys had been accurate, but they had found 3 others in addition to Dara's, where the boundaries had been moved. In each case, the errors benefited the Olmstead family or families allied with them. The findings were damning. Darren Olmstead had not been a wholesale thief, but he had been a systematic one, taking small pieces here and there where he thought he could get away with it. On the morning of the hearing, Dara woke early. Darren was already at her door, dressed in his formal clothes again, holding a bouquet of early crocuses. "For luck," he said, handing them to her. "We do not need luck," Dara said, accepting them. "We have the truth." "The truth and luck," Darren said with a slight smile, "just to be safe." They rode to Milford together under a pale blue sky. The courthouse was crowded again, but the atmosphere was different this time. Quieter, more somber. People knew what the county's review had found. This was not a hearing to determine if Darren Olmstead had moved a boundary. This was a hearing to determine what would be done about it. Judge Thorne called the hearing to order and summarized the findings of the county's review. Then she turned to Dara's case specifically. based on the original land grants, the survey conducted by Robert Harrow in 1781, the testimony of witnesses, and the physical evidence of the boundary stones, I find that the boundary between the Roth and Olmstead properties was indeed moved from its original location, Judge Thorne said. The current fence line is incorrect and should be restored to the original surveyed boundary. Dara felt tears prick her eyes. After all the months of waiting, of fighting, of uncertainty, it was over. She had won. Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, I am ordering Darren Olmstead to pay restitution to Dara Roth for the 20 years of lost use of the disputed land. The amount will be calculated based on the fair market value of pasture rent over that period. Additionally, Mr. Olmstead will be responsible for the costs of moving the fence to the correct location and for providing Mistress Roth with replacement livestock to compensate for the diminishment of her flock caused by the loss of the pasture. Darren stood. I accept the court's ruling and will comply with all requirements. Judge Thorne nodded. Very well. As for the other boundary discrepancies discovered during the county's review, I will be issuing separate rulings on those cases. But I want to make clear that the responsibility for these errors lies with Torben Olmstead, who is deceased and beyond the reach of justice. Darren Olmstead was a child when these boundaries were moved and bears no legal culpability for his father's actions. However, given the serious nature of these findings and the questions they raise about the integrity of boundaries surveyed by Torben Olmstead, I am recommending that the county conduct a vote on whether Darren Olmstead should continue to serve as fence viewer. Darren nodded, his expression calm. Dara wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but they were in a courtroom and she was the petitioner. So she stayed in her seat and kept her hands folded in her lap. Judge Thorne concluded the hearing and dismissed the court. As people began to file out, Dara finally allowed herself to move. She crossed to where Darren stood and took his hand. We did it, she said quietly. You did it, Darren corrected. This was your fight. We did it together, Dara insisted. And whatever happens with the vote, we will face that together too. Darren squeezed her hand. Together, he agreed. The vote on Darren's position as fence viewer was held the following week. It was not even close. By a margin of 3-1, the landowners of the district voted to remove him from office. They cited loss of confidence and the need for a fence viewer whose family history did not cast doubt on the boundaries. Darren took the news with quiet grace. He thanked the people who had supported him, accepted the decision of the majority, and went home to his farm. That evening, he and Dara sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the ridge. How are you? Dara asked. Relieved, actually, Darren said. I know that sounds strange, but I am. The position was a responsibility I inherited, not one I chose. Now I can just focus on the things that matter to me. Like what? Darren turned to look at her. Like you. Like building a life that is honest and good. Like making sure the land I do have is worked well and sustainably. Dara leaned her head on his shoulder. Those sound like good things to focus on. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. Somewhere on the ridge, an owl called. The air smelled of turned earth and growing things. I have been thinking, Darren said after a while, about the boundary. What about it? About when we set the new fence, Darren said. It should be done properly, publicly, with witnesses and a survey and everything documented, so there is never any question again about where the line is. I agree, Dara said. When should we do it? Spring, Darren said. As soon as the ground thaws enough to dig post holes, we can make it an occasion, invite the neighbors, set the new boundary stone together. Dara sat up and looked at him. There was something in his tone, something deliberate and significant. Just set the boundary stone, Darren smiled. Well, I was also thinking we could have a wedding if you wanted to. A small one right there on the boundary line, on the land that belongs to both of us now. Dara's heart skipped. Are you asking me to marry you? I am, Darren said. He took both her hands in his. I love you, Dara. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped out from behind that hedge and demanded to know why I was leaving flowers. You are strong and brave and good, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Dara felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. Darren pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. They were married on a bright morning in April, when the new grass was green and the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. The ceremony took place exactly on the newly restored boundary line, with the fresh carved boundary stone at their feet and both flocks grazing peacefully on either side. Father Benedict performed the ceremony. Esther Crane stood as Dara's witness, and a neighboring farmer named Thomas stood for Darren. The congregation was small, just a few close friends and the neighbors who had supported them through the hearing. Garrett Spence did not come, but Dara did not miss him. Dara wore a dress of soft green wool that brought out the color of her skin. Darren wore his best coat and a shirt Dara had mended for him, a small intimacy that made him smile every time he thought about it. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever came. Father Benedict pronounced them husband and wife, and as Darren kissed his bride, the small crowd erupted in cheers and applause. After the ceremony, they shared a meal on the grass, simple fare of bread and cheese and spring greens. Esther had made a cake, slightly lopsided but delicious. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter as the sun climbed high. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to drift away, Dara and Darren found themselves alone on the boundary line, standing beside their new stone. So this is it, Dara said, looking out over the land that was now fully hers. The end of the fight. The end of that fight, Darren corrected, the beginning of everything else. Dara turned to him, her new husband, and smiled. I like the sound of that. So do I, Darren said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single wildflower, a blue flax like the one he had been carrying the morning she had confronted him. I know I give you flowers every day now, but I wanted to leave this one here on the boundary stone, to remember where we started. Dara took the flower and tucked it into a crevice in the stone. To remember, she agreed, and to celebrate where we are going. They stood there together as the sun began its descent. Two people who had found each other through honesty and hardship, who had fought for justice and found love along the way. The boundary between their lands was clear now, marked and true. But the boundary between their hearts had dissolved entirely, leaving only the promise of a future built together. That summer, Dara's flock thrived on the restored pasture. The ewes grew fat and healthy, and when lambing season came, she had a record number of healthy lambs. She sold her wool at a good price, and for the first time in her life, had money left over after paying her debts. Darren focused on improving his own flock, bringing in a new ram from the valley and carefully selecting his breeding stock. He also began working as a surveyor for hire, using his skills to help other farmers resolve boundary questions fairly and honestly. Word spread that he was meticulous and impartial, and he built a new reputation based on his own work rather than his father's legacy. In the evenings, they worked side by side on whichever farm needed attention, blurring the lines between mine and yours until it all became simply ours. They talked about the future, about maybe combining the flocks entirely, about building a new barn that would serve both properties. And every morning, Darren still brought Dara flowers, not out of guilt anymore and not left in secret. He brought them to their shared table and presented them with a kiss, a daily reminder of the strange and difficult path that had led them to each other. By the time autumn came around again, Dara realized she was pregnant. She told Darren over breakfast one morning, watching his face transform from surprise to wonder to joy. He swept her into his arms, careful and exuberant at once, and declared it the best news he had ever received. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's green-tinted skin. They named him Lucas, and he was the first of what would eventually be 4 children, each one a bridge between 2 worlds, 2 families, 2 lives made one. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this autumn evening 1 year after the boundary had been restored, Dara and Darren sat on the porch of what they now simply called home, watching the sunset paint the ridge in shades of gold. "You ever regret it?" Darren asked, his arm around her shoulders. All the trouble, all the fighting, all the scrutiny, Dara thought about it. She thought about her mother, who would never know that the farm's struggles had not been her fault. She thought about the hard months of the hearing and the review, the whispers and the hostility. She thought about the risk Darren had taken in telling the truth. "No," she said finally, "I do not regret it. My mother would have wanted the truth to be known. And if we had not fought for it, I would never have really known you. So no regrets." "Good," Darren said softly, "because I do not have any either." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the sheep called to each other, settled and safe in their pasture. The boundary stone stood solid on the ridge, a marker of what had been lost and what had been restored. And on the porch of their farmhouse, a man and a woman who had found their way to each other through honesty and courage looked toward the future with hope. The wildflowers that Darren had once left in secret now grew in deliberate profusion around their house, planted and tended with care. Blue flax and columbine, wild roses and yarrow, lupine and aster. Every spring they bloomed, a living reminder that the small, faithful gestures of love could take root and grow into something beautiful and enduring. And every morning for the rest of their lives, Darren brought Dara flowers. Not because he owed her, but because he loved her. Not because he was sorry, but because he was grateful. And Dara received them with joy, these daily tokens of a love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something deep and true and permanent. The fence between their properties remained, a practical necessity for managing 2 flocks. But it was no longer a symbol of division or theft. It was simply a line on the land, clear and honest and true. And on either side of it, 2 people built a life together, raised children together, and proved that justice and love, though sometimes hard-won, were always worth fighting for. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Dara would smile and say that their father had courted her with wildflowers left on a fence. And Darren would add that their mother had taught him the true meaning of courage by refusing to accept less than justice. Together, they would tell the story of the crooked fence and the boundary restored, of guilt transformed into love, and of 2 people who had found in each other the honesty and grace that made a true partnership possible. It was a good story. And more importantly, it was a true one. The kind of truth worth fighting for, worth preserving, worth passing down. The kind of truth that, like wildflowers planted with care, would bloom again and again for generations to come.